free speech isn't just a political issue, it's a mental health issue.
And you talk about this in your book as well, of course, which I love to read. That words are violence, or silence is violence. It's what an anxiety-provoking way to live your life, right? To think that, heaven forbid, if I say the wrong words, it's like running someone over with my car, or if I hear the wrong words, it's like somebody hitting me and threatening my existence. And as you said, it's kind of weaponizing this, victim status.
What do you say to people that speak up and do get pushback from people? Welcome back to the Dr. Phil podcast. Joining me is Dr. Chloe Carmichael. People refer to her as Dr. Chloe. Like myself, she's trained in clinical psychology. She is a USA Today best-selling author and really one of the most trusted voices on emotional wellness and mental strength. She's taught at major universities and consulted for global law firms. She's been featured everywhere from the New York Times to Vanity Fair, ABC Nightline, Rolling Stone. Now, she's written a book that really is kind of right up my alley. The book is Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly. And I got to say, this is part wake-up call and part survival guide. And in it, Dr. Chloe argues that cancel culture thrives when good people stay silent. And she's got the tools to help you really feel comfortable speaking up, staying grounded, and how to build stronger relationships in the process. Because I promise you, you're not the only one that feels the way you feel. And you never know that until you actually venture out. And Dr. Chloe believes that free speech isn't just a political issue, it's a mental health issue. And her book shows how using your voice isn't just empowering, it can actually be really cathartic. It can be really healing. It can be really affirming. So I'm going to quit rattling about that and just welcome Dr. Chloe. Dr. Chloe, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. I can't tell you how much it means to me to be here with you. I was saying before that your book Family First was such a heart point for me, and We've Got Issues Too has been such an incredible read for me. So thank you for all that you're doing. It takes so much courage.
As you address in your book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly. It really is a decision point. People actually have to decide, am I going to give my power away to other people and let them decide whether or not I claim my space and speak up, or am I going to let them intimidate me and put me to the side? What caused you to write this book? Why this book? Why now?
What happened is I was living in New York City. As we all know, it's not easy to make it there. But I was doing it. So I had, gone through Columbia University, where I had done a lot of what we call self-censoring in order to get through and get the grades I needed in order to get into the clinical psych program I wanted, which, I did a lot of self-censoring there as well. And as I was trying to build my business, I was very thankful. I was getting a lot of media attention, which was great for the business. But I just always knew that there were certain things I couldn't say. I never said anything that was untrue, but I just avoided certain topics that I knew wouldn't work for the media. And that worked fine until COVID, when, the law then was that I was going to have to mask my then 3-year-old son. And that was really the red line for me. I just couldn't do it. And so my family and I actually fled to Florida. And in that process, since that was such a big deal to me, I wrote down all the reasons why I felt like it was harmful to mask children for such long periods of time. And it was organizing to me to even just write it all down. And I shared it with some colleagues to say, hey, am I missing something? Because I'm thinking of publishing this, but is there something embarrassingly wrong here? And because nobody else is talking about it that I could see. And my colleagues said, no, Chloe, there's nothing wrong here factually, but you should not publish it because it could discourage people from masking their children, which obviously I was like, okay, well, this makes no sense. So I published it. And then Dr. Jay Bhattacharya picked it up. Other people, Clay Travis picked it up. I was living in Florida. I was having open dialogue and sharing what I really thought about something. And I started realizing that my own cognitive process was improving, my emotional presence, my social relationships. I was really being authentic. And that's what touched off my interest in the mental health benefits of free speech.
It's interesting that you noticed it in yourself first, because we might notice headwinds because we really feel that if we're pushing against this zeitgeist to go along with the mob, to not push back, and we feel that pressure. But then when we get out of that and we actually get tailwinds, we get a wind at our back and it starts to get easier, sometimes we don't notice that right away. But when you pick up and move your whole family, that's a life decision. That had to be a big deal when you leave New York and you leave your lifestyle to go somewhere else. This had to be something where you thought, this is a life decision for my 3-year-old. You had to feel strongly that doing what they were telling you to do was going to have a truly adverse effect on that child.
Absolutely, Dr. Phil. So yeah, to me, I felt like, it felt like child abuse. I had a gut reaction to that and I just couldn't do it. And that's why I felt the need to write it all down, to really explore, the self-esteem issues I felt it could put on children, the communication issues, all those issues. But you're right, that was the red line for me. But honestly, in retrospect, I feel like it was a silver lining, because I was almost like a frog, that's getting cooked in like warmer and warmer water. And I just had been self-censoring and kind of going along because I wasn't aware of how it was affecting me. It was almost like slowly, bit by bit, going into the witness protection program or something where you're not really being yourself. And then that last thing where it came to not myself, but my child, I said, no, I cannot do that. And then it was truly a wake-up call once I started just connecting with my own thoughts again. That's one of the things I talk about in the book, is that we start with suppression, where we're consciously stopping ourselves. I know you know all this. And then we go to repression, where we're just doing it kind of automatically. And then we're going into denial. And as you said, we can self-censor because we think it's just going to make things easier. Oh, it's not hurting anything. I'll just keep some of my thoughts to myself. And a little self-restraint is actually a good thing. But I just had never stopped to think about it, about what that's actually really doing on a mental health level, as well as like a cognitive awareness level. And, we all know we're in an epidemic of loneliness. And so how that's degrading social support when, we're not being real with other people, or they're not being real with us. And to a certain degree, we stop being real with ourselves after a certain point.
You've heard me say it before. Real change starts with real understanding, and that's why I've had Dr. Daniel Amen on my show many times over the years. At Amen Clinics, they do something different. They look at your brain. With nearly 300,000 brain scans from patients in over 155 countries, they take the guesswork out of mental health care. Anxiety, depression, trauma, memory issues. If you're struggling, it's time for answers. Call 866-580-6569 or go to amenclinics.com/Dr. Phil and take the first step. Call 866-580-6569 or go to amenclinics.com/Dr. Phil. You got a BA in psychology from Columbia. You obviously hit it out of the park there. Did you at the time look around at these people that had this group think and this open hostility towards empiricism and science and common sense in many respects? And even though you weren't saying anything, did you look at some of these people that were devoid of critical thinking and say to yourself, what is wrong with these people? How can they ignore science, empirical data, and blindly adhere to some of this thinking without challenge, without debate, without what did you say to yourself about that, knowing how you feel about the importance of the ability to ask questions and express views?
So, Dr. Phil, I think one of the things that helped is that I actually did not finish college till I was 29. So, I had formed somewhat of a sense of self as well already. Um, at the same time, because I hadn't finished college, at that point, and I was going a little later. I was a yoga teacher before I was a psychologist, so I always had a strong interest in the body-mind connection, and that was what made me want to go get a PhD in clinical psychology in the first place. But when I was at Columbia as, an older student, I had an extremely deferential attitude towards the professors, and I really regarded it as kind of a hallowed ground. And I felt like, if there's something I don't understand or that doesn't make sense to me, it's my job to try to learn and understand it. And I took that attitude through much of Columbia. And then when I got to my clinical psych PhD program, I did have a little bit more just confidence in my own opinions. And I had enough knowledge that I started to feel like I could truly activate my critical thinking skills. And I definitely had one of those wake up call moments. So I was actually working in a lab that was somewhat focused on CRT, on critical race theory. And I remember, I worked in a variety of labs. So, there were various situations, but there was one situation in particular where we were looking at some data. And this was, during the Obama presidency. And we weren't seeing some of the quote typical effects that that CRT researchers might have been wanting. And I remember saying, I wonder if we're not seeing this because, with the Obama presidency and whatnot, maybe some of the effects that started this critical race theory, maybe they're changing, and maybe that would be good news. And one of the researchers in charge said to me, Chloe, that's not the effect we're going for here. And that was one of those moments where I was like, okay, this is how the sausage gets made. And there were various other moments where I remember I asked a question at one point, and somebody said to me, careful, Chloe. And I said, careful of what? What do you mean? And it was just one of those times where it was really during the PhD program, Dr. Phil, to answer your question, where I started to really realize I kind of had to sing a certain song if I wanted to get through. And my heart really goes out to younger students because, like I said, I was old enough that I had enough life experiences and my brain was more formed. But I have such applause and respect for younger students that are navigating these universities and managing to really still hang on to their true critical thinking abilities.
Well, were they actually telling you or cautioning you against reporting actual data instead of spinning it and interpreting it differently?
I want to be careful what I don't want to levy any accusations, but I will say the feeling I got was that there was a very particular viewpoint and a very particular result that they were going for. And that's one of the things I'm so thankful for. I think it's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya that's also, now in his position as director of NIH, is, putting out new standards for research. This is probably why a lot of the research coming out of universities has had a replicability crisis. And he's saying, researchers have to acknowledge in advance what their hypothesis is. They can't just go on a fishing expedition to find some little tiny angle of the statistics that supports what they want to say. Because, I think there's an incredible amount of bias, and even to the point, as you said, of spin in the way that the data gets reported on a general level. I'm really concerned about that.
And I'm not asking you to make specific allegations, but if it's not a revelation that so much of the research that's being done now, and I put research in air quotes, that's funded even at top universities, that's funded by people, stakeholders in the outcome, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or tobacco companies or oil companies or whatever, they're funding the research. And these stakeholders have a great investment in the outcome. And that's just not objective research. It's not blind research. If they're funding millions of dollars into research that impacts the outcome of which impacts their financial interest, and that continued funding depends on how those results are reported. I mean, come on, little Abner can figure that out. Lassie can tell you that's not objective research. Everybody knows that. I've talked to Robert Kennedy Jr. about that a number of times. I've talked to President Trump about it. They all know that there is a conflict of interest and that's got to change.
You're so correct, Dr. Phil, of course. And, that, of course, that's the financial motivation side of it. And then also, for example, in researching for my book, one of the things that I found was it was, kind of something I'd sensed, but was interesting to see confirmed numerically, which is that there's an incredible political ideology bias within psychology departments. It's true within many departments, but in psychology departments, for example, I think it's like 5% of faculty that have a conservative political identification. And that's of the whole faculty in the whole field. So in every field, in every department I was ever in, I would say everybody, had a certain political leaning. And that's fine. I actually embrace, of course, the diversity of opinions and thought. But when you have an entire department where everybody's liberal, everybody has the same liberal/progressive mindset, and then they're literally selecting their cohorts of PhD students for people that are going to align with their values. And so then we get this, just incredible groupthink. And for quality intellectual debate, we need to have appropriate challenges. The right needs it, the left needs it, everybody needs it, but they're not getting it. And I remember even after I left my department, after I had graduated with my PhD, I visited with one of my old professors, and I sort of came out of the closet to him. And I told him about how I had just, kind of felt like I had to just, sing a song, as I called it, to just, that there, if I challenged certain things, I knew that they would not really let me get through, that they would, kind of smear me in certain ways. And he had an interesting response. He said he was really sorry that I felt like I had to do that. But he said at the same time that he didn't see any need at all for the department to change, and he didn't see any need at all for the field to change. And it just surprises me that as psychologists, they bend over backwards to get diversity in every way possible, ironically, except for intellectual and viewpoint diversity.
That's interesting to me because I've seen exactly the same thing. They sing the song of diversity in everything except ideology, and there it's groupthink. And you can have racial diversity, age diversity, you can have all of this, but if everybody has to line up and think the same, you don't have a diversity of thought. You don't have people stimulating one another to come up with an idea that is not individually in the group, but collectively. It's like, now 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 12 instead of 6. Everything comes together, and the sum of the parts is so much greater than you get with the individuals. And that's what we're looking for, and that's what we're missing right now. And one of the things that you talk about in your book that I thought was really important, you stress that over pathologizing everyday struggles creates a victim mindset that undermines resilience. And I think the ideology on campuses right now is failing to prepare these young people for the real world, because they are over pathologizing these everyday struggles. And then when they get out into a full contact, full competitive world, I don't think they're going to be prepared for it.
I agree. It's the idea that, words are violence. And I know, again, you talk about this in your book as well, of course, which I love to read, that words are violence, or, silence is violence. It's what an anxiety provoking way to live your life, right? To think that, heaven forbid, if I say the wrong words, it's like running someone over with my car, or if I hear the wrong words, it's like somebody, hitting me and threatening my existence. And as you said, it's kind of weaponizing this, victim status. So one of the things I talk about in the book as well is the secondary gains of victimhood, which again, I'm sure you're completely, of course, aware of, but just for your listening audience, that the classic example in Psychology 101 textbooks is a little girl breaks her leg, she has a cast, she gets excused from gym class, everybody signs her cast. She starts to enjoy the attention and the perks so much that when the doctor says it's time for the cast to come off, she genuinely believes, she's come to be so attached to it. She says, no, it hurts. I still need the cast. She's not even necessarily trying to lie. She's just psychologically become so attached to it. And the same thing I think can happen with these, secondary gains of victimhood, and these constant chirping about hate speech and bullying, to the point where I feel like those are the bullies. Those are the hateful people that are interfering with people's ability to just use language, which is our primary system cognitively to organize and develop our thoughts, and to exchange information, and to form social bonds, to develop good ideas and to discard bad ideas. Language hinges on all of those things, or all of those things hinge on language. So yeah, I feel like when we start mixing all that up with victimhood, then of course we're not preparing these students very well to go out into the world. Unfortunately, I think what they're actually doing is bringing it into corporate America. So I'm seeing a lot of that too.
I couldn't agree more. I've seen it all, from folks stuck in toxic relationships to people whose houses look like a tornado went through a craft store. But there's one problem I see plaguing America, and it ain't on the couch. It is the couch. Hideline offers customizable leather options so you can pick the color that fits your style. They've got specialized hybrid foam and pocketed coil cushion systems to help you sit comfortably for hours. For a limited time, you can get 10% off store-wide and free shipping with code Dr. Phil 10 at hideline.com. Let me ask you, how do you explain, if you were explaining to parents or a corporate culture shaper, whether it was HR or management, how do you explain to them why victimhood is so seductive to people, why it's so appealing to people?
I think people understand intuitively, that it's seductive and appealing to people because it sort of absolves you of your, feeling of any, personal responsibility, and that it can seem attractive in that regard, that you don't feel that, you need to do anything or change anything. There's an example I give in the book about a woman that is not performing well at the job. She's having performance issues. She tries to blame it on being, quote, bullied, by a coworker. And then through some of our work together, she comes to acknowledge that there's actually a skills gap. And when she comes to just be honest about that, the good news is that she's able to get training and fill the skills gap. So I share about, for example, the internal and external locus of control, that when we have an external locus of control and we think other people are affecting our lives, that can sound good because we feel we don't have to be responsible for it, but it's actually the internal locus of control that's associated with better mental health outcomes. Because then when you're in the driver's seat, the good news is that you can make some changes and have things work out better.
I think people need to understand that if they give away that locus of control, I mean, I used to, I can remember in school, whether it was middle school or graduate school, I would look at people that would come out and say, "Oh man, I did well on that test. I was so lucky." I would think, "Really?" Or they would say, "Oh yeah, the test was easy." Well, was it? Or were you really well prepared? And it was interesting, even before I knew what locus of control was, and even before I had the psychological symbol system, I used to marvel at how people would not give themselves credit or hold themselves accountable for the outcomes. And I think it's because I grew up poor and in athletics. And the two came together interestingly, because when you're poor, intentions don't matter a lot, it's results. I mean, you either work and get paid or you don't. And in athletics, they don't care who you are. They care how fast you can run, how high you can jump, and how many people you can knock down. And nothing else matters. It's just results, results, results. And that's what I'm saying. I think we've got all of these liberal professors that say they're not talking about toxic masculinity. They're talking about masculinity being toxic. And they're talking about being competitive, goal-oriented, and looking for financial gain or security is somehow gauche. That's just, well, why are you talking about that? We should have equal outcomes. Well, no, actually, we shouldn't. I think that's the ultimate setup for failure. And we've got so many of these liberal what's the ratio? I mean, it's got to be 20-1.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's about 20-1. And that's just in psychology departments. Journalism departments, I think, are more like 28-1. And so when you think about the narrative effect of what that means for the media, and so again, Dr. Phil, that's why I'm so thankful that, you've just stepped out of that whole arena and you're just taking it directly to the people now to share, your thoughts.
When they shut the schools down and started masking kids and shutting the school down, I came out and said, let me tell you people something. Shutting these schools down when we have the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness among young people since we started keeping records, yanking the support system out from under these kids at this critical time is going to create more damage than this virus ever could. I promise you this is a bad mistake, and you don't have a plan for getting these schools back open and getting these children back into this support system. And by the way, when you do this, all these mandated reporters, all these people that are keeping their eyes on kids looking to be sure they're spotting if they're being abused, sexually molested, whatever, by their caregivers, all those mandated reporter eyes are not going to be on these kids. What you're doing is abandoning them to their abusers and locking them up behind closed doors where frustration effects are going to go high. And sure enough, reports dropped as much as 50% in some areas. Did abuse go down 50%? Of course not. Just reports went down 50%. And I said, you're going to create more problems with this long shutdown than the virus ever would. And you can't believe the level of attack that I got. Oh my God, you're an absolute quack. This is heresy. How can you say this? The hate mail, the condemnation. And I just doubled down and said, you're absolutely wrong. You're absolutely wrong. And when you talk to the pediatric epidemiologists, they tell you today that it has cost double-digit millions years of life lost for those kids because of the gap in achievement academically, the poorer jobs they will get, meaning they're higher risk jobs, the poorer insurance they'll have, the slower disease recognition, slower intervention. I mean, it'll shave years off the end of their lives. And with 50 million kids in public schools, just multiply it out. We've taken this generation and crippled them, and there's no plan to close the gap even today.
Yeah, I hear you on that, Dr. Phil, and I'm really relate again to the sense that you mentioned of being attacked and that it was scary to speak up. If it wasn't for the fact, that we were literally talking about little children, I don't think I could have done it either. So, I mean, again, to this issue of bias and to just the numbers, whether it be say in education and the faculty as well as in journalism. My previous book, Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, is about the healthy function of anxiety. And that book did really well. It's, translated into 5 languages. But when
Right.
I wanted to do this book, my very prestigious agent dropped me. My big publisher said, Chloe, we'd love to do another book with you, but just not this one. And, I'm so thankful to Skyhorse Publishing because, they did indeed take it on. But it was amazing to see how the machine, could just kind of turn against you. And to your point as well about you had the courage to speak up and tell them, hey, you're wrong. And that was where I found my courage too. But one of the chapters in the book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly, is called Common Objections to Free Speech. And one of them is, what about misinformation? And it gets to that, COVID point. And it's so interesting because the things that we were stifled and censored from saying, many of them turned out to be exactly true, exactly correct. And even if they hadn't, the point is that we develop good ideas, discard bad ideas, expose falsehoods through speech, through open dialogue. I share in the book, for example, Galileo was jailed for saying that the earth orbits the sun. And, there was a time when all the experts testified to Congress that, cigarettes were just fine for you. There was a time when our own profession was doing lobotomies, right? So experts are wrong all the time. And people have to be able to have open conversations and to discuss and debate.
One of the quotes I have in We've Got Issues is, I would rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question. And that's where we are right now. There are answers that we just aren't supposed to question. And you talk about that. You advocate for open, respectful debate, even about controversial topics, without fear of being silenced. When we talk about debate at college levels, when I went to school, long time before you went to school, we welcomed the other side of an issue. And you'd go and listen and you'd hear their thinking so you'd know how to defeat them. You'd find out, here's their thing, and I can go back and study up on how to shoot holes in this. But now it's the heckler's veto. They shout them down. They don't let them come. And that, to me, is insane. But that's what cancel culture is doing. And you talk about how we've got to have that back in our society, and that is important.
Definitely. Yeah. So, I mean, I have techniques in the book for speaking up as well as for listening respectfully, because both are important. I actually call it listening resiliently again, because so many people are genuinely afraid to quote, be triggered, or, they feel like they can't hear the wrong thing. And, Dr. Phil, you and I, of course, know as clinical psychologists, my legal mandate, and I imagine yours is too, is if a patient tells me that he's going to go shoot somebody, it is my legal duty to go and inform the police. If a patient tells me that he's going to go say something nasty to his neighbor, it is illegal for me to violate his confidentiality. And of
Exactly.
course, the primary difference is that, that words are not actual violence. And so that attitude is permeating our campuses. And it combines with, as we discussed, the faculty bent, but then there's also, unfortunately, not only does the faculty tend to sway one way, but it happens to sway towards in a direction of liberals, which are statistically, I share this in the book, I call it the 5Ds. And this is something liberals would own themselves. This is by their own self-report. Liberals are statistically more likely to defriend on Facebook, to distance in real life, to drop a relationship altogether, to disinvite a speaker, as you mentioned, the heckler's veto, or to decline to date, all over political differences. Now, I have to say, decline to date, I can sort of understand, because if you're dating for marriage, you might want to date someone that shares, your values on a deeper level. But all of the other four of the 5Ds, when we look at those as kind of markers of social hostility, and then we know that as well, there's this power structure where the faculty are all kind of thinking the same way. They have all this extra power, and they're more likely to display those social ostracization behaviors. It can be really a toxic environment on the campus, as well as an intellectually deprived environment on the campus.
And that's terrible for people to have to live with and experience that. And I'm wondering, what does the American Psychological Association say about that, if you know? Because you're right. If you have a patient that gives you a specific threat, I think it began with the Tarasoff decision, as I recall, that we're required to alert the person and or the authorities about a specific threat of violence against someone. But words, we would be in serious trouble if we reported that. So there's a clear difference. What position does the American Psychological Association take with regard to that? Because speech has been weaponized. Do they talk about that?
To be honest, I kind of stopped reading their emails a long time ago.
Yeah, me too. That's why I'm asking, because I just said, I don't go down that road anymore.
I will tell you though, I participated in a documentary for PragerU a couple years ago about, the myth of toxic masculinity. And of course, the APA was really championing, in my view, a real smear on, just masculinity in general. And I've seen whatever emails I do see from them are talking about how to, quote, fight back, against the current administration and how to champion DEI. They don't seem to understand that it's gone the wrong way. And again, I look at groupthink with that. So one of Irving Yannis, who's the psychologist that coined the term groupthink, he had 8 primary factors, and one of them is actually self-censorship that leads to this groupthink. Another one of them is a belief in the moral superiority of the group, and another one is the presence of self-appointed mind guards. So and the others as well, they just, when you read them, you're like, oh, wow, this is exactly what we're seeing right now, in my opinion.
I've seen every major medical group in America has signed off on gender affirming care. That's a marketing term. But the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, just all of them has signed off on that, when the entire world has moved their position. If they had gone down that road, they have moved their position and said, we don't think this is the way to go. Empirical data suggests that they don't have the ability to say that this is long-term safe. They don't have the ability to say there aren't long-term serious adverse consequences. But yet, in America, they're still caving to the pressure from the fringe groups because we don't have critical thinking. We don't have universities that are teaching people to speak back. And that's what you're talking about. And And we're so influenced now by social media, and you really highlight how these algorithms reward both outrage and suppression instead of mental health and inquiry. How did we get so far down that wrong road?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Phil. And I love that chapter in your book too about the algorithms. And, again, going back to that groupthink, the idea that when you have this illusion of unanimity, and what you mentioned as well in your book about the spiral of silence that another researcher had discussed, which is that whether it be through social media, and thank goodness, right, that Elon Musk has bought Twitter and that we can have free speech on there. But it used to be that you would go on Twitter and you would think, hey, I'm really the only person who thinks that saying a man can't become a woman, doesn't make any sense. And Dr. Phil, you and I both compared all that to the emperor's new clothes, right? But
Yeah.
but the more that people don't see anybody else questioning it, like I said, when I wrote my own blog about the harms of masking children, I second guessed myself. I had to show it to colleagues to say, gosh, am I missing something? Am I going to make a fool of myself? Am I missing something obvious here? Because when nobody else is talking about it, or as you said, when the algorithm is just only feeding you one side and reinforcing only one side, you can come to think that there's a social consensus. That's actually another one of Irving Yannis's groupthink factors, is a false sense of social consensus, which of course is fed, by that illusion of unanimity, as well as the belief in the moral superiority of the group. So, labeling people as, well, you're transphobic, or you're Islamophobic if you want to, discuss or inquire about anything going on that has to do with anything related to any of those identities. And I would just say as well, unfortunately, Dr. Phil, you mentioned, well, why are these organizations like the American Association of Pediatrics, quote, caving to these things? I don't know if they're caving as much as they're leading the charge. And in some cases, you mentioned marketing, maybe even just really enjoying to cash the checks. Because Abigail Schreier, she wrote a wonderful book about some of the social contagion aspects of trans. And then she wrote another amazing book called Bad Therapy, about our own profession and some of the problems. So I probably foolishly tried again. I've largely stepped away from the listservs of our own profession because it's such an echo chamber, and I just feel like it always goes sideways. But I waded in and I shared Abigail Schreier's book, Bad Therapy, on a listserv for psychologists. And I said, hey, I'm really enjoying this book. I'm curious if anybody else has read this. Within minutes, multiple people wrote in and they said, I would never read anything by her. She's completely transphobic, blah, 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 blah. And these are intelligent people. But it's like I blame it on the group think, Dr. Phil. I don't know. I don't know what else to say.
And then just even reading it, they start putting you in a category in a list, and there are things you may not even know that impact you because you may be frozen out of certain things, excluded from certain things because they're saying, oh, she reads these books and all of that sort of thing. And it really worries me, particularly as you say, you were more mature when you were going through that educational process. But as you point out, think about the young people whose brains aren't completely formed. They don't know who they are yet. They're very impressionable, and they're a captive audience for these authority figures who are telling them, and they may be in a class in art history, but yet somebody is pushing an ideology on them that has nothing to do with the course description, but they're pushing their own agenda on them. And that worries me a lot.
I completely agree with that. And, that's why, again, I offer techniques in the book. So part one is about the cognitive and emotional processes about language and common objections to free speech and all those types of things, and why those objections actually don't really make sense when we think them through. But then part two, as I mentioned, is about techniques. And I have had parents as well as grandparents getting this book for their, university students. And so just to share with your listeners, if they find it helpful, there's a few basic ideas I could share if that's okay, so people can have a takeaway.
You talk about 7 tools for speaking up. Let's talk about some of those that you think people can actually use as takeaways to change how they go through life.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Because I do want to share with people that the good news is that we're not just captives. We're not stuck in that internal or external locus of control. So one thing, if you have a university student going off there, is in advance to check out the university policies about open discourse and all of those types of things. Learn about the policies in advance, because it's a lot easier to realize when a professor is going outside the lines. I didn't even know this, but like at my school, the professors would literally have political posters and things like that up. And I didn't even know that they weren't supposed to be doing that. So understanding in advance what the policies are about what you can say, that can empower a student. It can also be helpful to have an ally. So if your student is thinking about speaking up in class and saying, you know what, actually, professor, I am wondering, about a different theory or a different way of looking at such and such. Sometimes it can help to have an ally. So they might want to talk to a friend or two in the class in advance and say, I'm going to raise my hand and raise this point. And it would mean the world to me if we could have a plan that, you might say, yeah, I was wondering the same thing, so that you don't feel, like you're totally alone. And if for whatever reason, I've been there, that you just feel like it's not, I can't do this, I would end up failing the class or whatever, which, by the way, I think another possibility is to do kind of a Project Veritas style recording of what happens if you have a student that's a little bit bolder. But if not, another kind of last resort, at least, is to make sure that you are talking to somebody, because when you're in an abusive situation, and I do consider it an abuse of power, when the professor runs the classroom in a way that the students cannot even ask a logic-based question. When you're in an abusive situation, what's really important is that you keep talking about it, so that you don't start in your head to normalize it and check out and go from, repression to suppression to denial and become vulnerable to groupthink. So at the very least, talk to somebody, your family, your friends, and explain what the professor is saying, and talk about how it doesn't make sense. At least stay grounded in reality yourself.
I think those are really good action steps. And, I worry about giving people some ideas about sourcing policy, because I know if you go to like Harvard, for example, and you read their policy and then you look at their practice, you'd think you're on 2 different campuses, because you read their policy and it's like, hey, listen, we're for diversity of ideas. We want to nurture our students. We want to do this. And then you look at their ratings with FIRE, for example, they're so low on the list, they have their own category. They are the worst on free speech. I think they're 53 out of 52. They're the worst of all, but you read the policy and it says it's great. People have to go beyond what they tell you, who they tell you they are. You've got to find forums where students can speak anonymously and say, here's what's really going on. Here's what's really happening. You've got to talk to some students that can speak without fear of retribution. And there are message boards and sections on places like Reddit and other places where students can tell you what they think. Now, that doesn't mean they're correct, but you can investigate it enough to really find out, so you know what you're getting into.
I agree, Dr. Phil, that that's helpful to do when you're evaluating a school. But to your point, if universities are putting one thing in print and having another thing in practice, I think it can be extremely helpful for the students to know the policy and know what their rights actually are, and potentially be able to come forward and get some kind of accountability, or at least understand what their rights are if they do want to make a complaint, or if they do want to, make the case, whether it be legally or in any other format, that the school is not giving them what the school is supposed to give them.
Well, I couldn't agree more. You've got to have a baseline. And of course, students don't want to go get into a war zone from the beginning. They want to go somewhere that they can get an education
Yes.
instead of a fight. And if they can find that out ahead of time and avoid the fight, I've talked to a lot of young people that have really changed their academic objectives in terms of where they might want to go based on what I have called intellectual rot in some of our elite universities. I've talked to a lot of young people that have said, that at one time, some of these Ivy League schools would have been my objective, and now they're not. I would rather go somewhere else where I can actually get an education with some balance instead of just an ideological spin in one direction. I don't want to go there anymore. So I think it is changing.
I think you're totally right. I mean, as you said, I went to Columbia, my husband went to Harvard. Neither one of us wants our kids to go to those schools if things stay as they are. We're talking about Hillsdale, Liberty here in Florida. DeSantis is working on a new college of, revitalizing that. So yeah, I think you're right. If the actual goal of going to school is to get a good education, which is what it should be, then students might do well to actually learn about the actual practices on the ground before they enroll.
What do you say to people that speak up and do get pushback from people? Maybe they speak up in a neighborhood barbecue, they speak up in their Sunday school class, they speak up at work at maybe a lunch break, and they really are a lone voice, and people label them and say, oh, you're a Trumper, or what are you, some kind of conservative right winger? They start pushing back at them. What do you tell people if they find themselves in that situation? You address it in the book. Just what are some highlights?
First of all, I can understand that we probably all become so sensitized to some of that it can feel alarming almost at first. We're cancel culture and all that stuff. But one of the things that I also encourage people to try to do if they get pushback is actually to welcome it, because again, that's part of the true diversity of opinions and of thoughts. And so sometimes even just, reflecting back to the person, like, okay, so I hear what you're saying is that you think it's transphobic that I don't want a boy to play on our girls' soccer team league. Like, that's how you feel. That's what you're saying. And just invite the person to tell you more. Sometimes that can actually be disarming. I know, Dr. Phil, one of the things that you say, and I completely agree, is that people want to feel heard. And so sometimes just letting people know that, modeling for them that you can actually handle disagreement, and you'll even invite them to share. And then once they've shared, you can say, well, would you like to hear how I feel or why I view it differently? And if they'll actually own that they don't want to, if they'll say, no, I don't want to, then you can say, okay, I hear that. And then you don't have to, cast your pearls before swine. But if that can sometimes actually stimulate an open dialogue.
I think if you're patient and you do model what you want to get back, sometimes we do get what we put out.
Yeah.
And if you don't, bow your neck and become combative, sometimes, not always, but sometimes you can take the air out of the room and calm things down some. And I must say, I've been very outspoken against anti-Semitic speech and conduct, and I look at the criticism and death threats and all that I get in levels that you can't imagine. And I must say, the more violent the threat, the worse the grammar. And really, I think when people run out of socially acceptable ways to express themselves, they default to physical violence, and that sort of thing. And I think people need to remember that only 20% of the people use Twitter, for example. And of those 20%, 80% of the messages are posted by like 10% of the people that use it. So you're getting down to a real small group of people that make most of the noise. And I think people don't really understand how bot farms are deployed to drive ideology. And you could be arguing with a non existent human being. I think we have to sometimes take a deep breath and say, how important is this person's opinion to the things that really matter in my life? My health, my well being, my family, my children. I think sometimes we amplify the importance of other people's opinions over the things that really matter in our own life. And sometimes it's good to kind of take a deep breath and do a check on how much we need their approval. And if we sometimes check our whole card on that, we'll feel a little better.
Totally. Yes, Dr. Phil. So, I mean, what you said so many great things there. And, to your point about the more violent, and I'm so sorry you're receiving that kind of filth, but it is interesting, as you and I know as psychologists, when you have someone who has a problem with violence or anger management, the first thing we want to do is teach them to use their words, is to teach them to communicate. And so ironically, this, attempt to squash speech and stifle speech, I think is, leading more often for people to feel like they're gonna, pop up violently. And, as you said, if we are getting pushback from people, we can get very invested, at that in the moment. And so some of the techniques as well that I share with people, one is called relax your body and your mouth. Like, it's so interesting that if you're sitting across from, that relative at the Thanksgiving table and they're saying things that you don't agree with, you might notice your whole body is almost tensing up, and your mouth is, we call it chomping at the bit for a
Yeah.
reason. And so if we can learn to just, I share some techniques in the book to relax your body and to relax your mouth, and learn some listening techniques that I share. Think about a time in the past when you yourself held a political or social viewpoint that you now kind of cringe when you think about, right? So we've all, at least I have, had a viewpoint or two in the past that I kind of now feel is a little silly. And so when we hear someone saying something that we feel like, how could they think that? It can be helpful to take ourselves back to those times as well, to just find the humanity in all of us.
When you were talking about relax your body and your mouth, the first thing that came to my mind, and that's in chapter 6, where you're talking about 5 tools for self-restraint. Some other things that Dr. Chloe was talking about there were find the facts, relax your body and your mouth, imagine an audience, count the minutes, count the questions, and transfer the grace, thought replacements. And when I was reading this section on relax your body and your mouth, the thing that jumped into my mind when I was looking at that was face validity. And I really want to caution people, because sometimes the solutions that are most elegant, they're elegant because they're simple, they're doable, they're profound, and in their elegance, they lack face validity. People will look at them and say, well, that's so simple. I mean, how could that help? And because they don't seem fancy, because they don't have a lot of 75-cent words in them, people can say, that doesn't sound like much. You couldn't be more wrong, because it's those very things of controlling your physiology in the moment so you don't get overamped can have the most profound effect on how you handle that stressful situation and circumstance. And I've done a lot of work with organic pain, and I talk to people about relaxation. And I'm not talking about chilling, I'm talking about physiological absence of tension and truly relaxing their muscle groups, large and small. And 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 unless you can really sell them on its importance so they don't poo-poo it and jump over it, if you can get them to buy in and they truly commit to it, it can be so important. And that is one that I just would not want people to jump over in your book, because it's what can get them through that tense moment in a social situation so they don't have a meltdown, they don't have a blow up, they can get through it and not overreact. It's so important. So it may not have face validity because it doesn't seem fancy, but it's one of the most powerful things you talk about in that section.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phil. And, I bet that the imagine an audience one, I'm sure that you saw that every day.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, like for the listening audience, of course, the idea there with imagine an audience is that if you're having a conversation with someone, you feel yourself getting heated and you want to make sure that you don't, become that person kind of going over the top, is to imagine that there's a security tape and that this video of your conversation is going to be played somewhere, or that your mentor or role model is going to watch that video. And I'm sure Dr. Phil on his show all the time, people go on and they have what we call their Sunday manners. And that's
Yeah.
because when we do feel like someone's watching, we can be on our best behavior, and we can actually use that for a good thing if we feel ourselves getting heated and we want to like activate that social awareness factor.
Tool number 3 in chapter 5 in your book really dovetails with that well, where you talk about role playing. Don't do this for the first time in real time. Do this where you actually role play it. I tell parents to do this with their kids all the time when they're talking about how to handle it if a predator comes up to them. Drop, roll, scream, kick, all that stuff. If they're doing that for the first time when a real monster has their hands on them, they're likely to freeze. Statistics tell us that. But if they've done it in the front yard with mom or dad or Uncle Joe or whatever 10 times, then they've broken down that first barrier and they're more likely to do it if it really comes up at the mall or in a parking lot of the park. They need to role play it. And it's the same thing here. If you've actually role played some of these things, so when it comes up, you don't freeze. You've actually done this a few times. You've actually said some of the things. You've like they tell you when you're in speech class, memorize your intro and your finish. Get started, role play it so you've done it before. That way you're less likely to freeze up at the time.
Exactly. You're less likely to freeze up or to just, feel nervous and maybe even over respond, right? If you're feeling less intimidated and nervous because you've practiced, that conversation with your professor or your HR person or whatever, you've practiced it with a friendly audience, you'll come across as more relaxed. And then that might evoke the other person to be a little bit more relaxed too, hopefully.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Chloe, we're out of time. The book that we've been talking about is Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly. And Dr. Chloe is a best-selling author. One of her previous books was Nervous Energy. I highly recommend that as well. This book is in pre-sale right now. You can get it, so it will be there and you'll have it before anybody else. I've read the book. I highly recommend it, not just because we agree on some things. She talks about some of the things I've talked about, but she adds real depth and richness to some of these issues. I highly recommend that you buy more than one copy of this because you're going to want to share it with people you care about. You're going to find things in there that you're going to want to share with the people you care about. When the book comes out in November, I would love to have you on the show, and we'll have some guests on that deal with these issues, and we can deal with them directly and talk about their situations and circumstances, because unfortunately this problem's not going away between now and November 4th. It's still going to be here and we're still going to be managing it. So,
Of course, I would be more than delighted for that, Dr. Phil. And I want to thank you for being such an inspiration on so many levels, to me as a psychologist, as a person. Like I said, your Family First book has been amazing for me as a wife and a mother. It's been really enriching for me. So I treasure that time that we spent here today. And of course, anytime that you want to connect, just let me know.
I'll do it, and we will talk soon. Congratulations on the book. Once again, it's Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters, How to Use It Fearlessly. So get a copy, and listen, it's not a paperweight. You have to read it. You have to actually read it and then do what it says. It will be very impactful. So highly recommended. And Dr. Chloe, we'll talk very soon.
Amazing. Thanks again.